Hey, it's Professor Gould, and in this set of lectures, we're going to talk about genetics and inheritance, and that is the patterns through which traits are passed from one generation to the next. So let's start off with a little bit of review about genes and cells. You remember that in the human body, we have trillions of somatic cells. Each one has 46 chromosomes. Chromosomes are matched up in homologous pairs. Each homologous pair, it consists of one paternal chromosome and one maternal chromosome, so one from the father, one from the mother. And each chromosome, it contains a number of genes, and those genes encode the information for making physical traits in the form of proteins, either proteins that will be in the body or proteins that will make something in the body. Each chromosome carries one allele of a gene, and this is a word that's new to us, so let's talk about this. Okay, so an allele is a variant of a gene. Okay, so for example, these are two adorable poodles. Poodles have a single gene that controls what color their fur is, their coat color. And that gene has two alleles. So one allele makes a black coat, one allele makes a brown coat. A little bit about how we write these. We always, when we're talking about genetics and when we're talking about inheritance, we're going to use capital and lowercase letters for the alleles, except in a couple of cases where we have a different notation. But when there's two alleles, we're going to use a capital letter and a lowercase letter. The capital letter, it represents the dominant allele, and that means the allele that shows up if it's present. Okay, the recessive allele is always going to be shown by the lowercase letter. Okay, so the black coat is going to be dominant in poodles. The brown coat is recessive in poodles. What does that mean? Okay, so let's talk another couple of words we need. So the alleles are, remember, the variant of the gene, and the gene is going to code for a specific trait. The genotype is the alleles that an individual has. So for poodles with coat color, the poodle could have two of the recessive alleles, in which case we would say it's homozygous recessive. Homozygous meaning the same alleles. To uppercase or dominant alleles, the poodle would be homozygous dominant. Let's fix that right there. And if you have one of each, or if the poodle has one of each, we say they're heterozygous. Now, one common mistake that students make is they'll say heterozygous recessive or heterozygous dominant. Okay, heterozygous means two different alleles. Okay, so just heterozygous. So two of the same is homozygous. And if you have two recessive, homozygous recessive, two dominant, you have homozygous dominant. And if you have two different alleles, then it's heterozygous. Okay? Now, in the case of simple dominance, which is what we're going to talk about first. Of course, inheritance is going to be more complicated than that, but we're just going to talk about simple dominance first. The dominant allele is expressed if it's present. So both the homozygous dominant and the heterozygous poodle show black fur because they have the black allele. The brown allele only shows up in the absence of the dominant allele. And in most cases, that means that the individual has two of them. But remember, X and Y chromosomes are different, and they don't have the same genes on them. And so if something is on either the X or the Y, then it gets expressed if there's only one copy. Okay, so don't say that a recessive allele gets expressed if there's two copies, because that's not always true. Okay, it gets expressed if there's no dominant allele to overshadow it. The other word we need when we're talking about inheritance is phenotype. So the genotype is the actual alleles that an individual carries. The phenotype is the physical trait. So the genotypes, homozygous, dominant, and heterozygous, create black fur phenotype. The genotype homozygous recessive creates the brown fur phenotype. Okay, so genotype is the genes, phenotype is the physical expression of those genes. All right, so now that we've got that, let's talk about how we figured out all of this stuff about inheritance and dominant and recessive. And the man who figured that out was this guy, Gregor Mendel, who was an Augustinian friar in what is now the Czech Republic. He lived in the mid-18 to late 1800s. And he's the one who figured out that certain traits were dominant and certain traits were recessive. He figured out that multiple traits were inherited independently of each other. But unfortunately, because he wasn't the right sort of person, the scientific community of the day didn't pay any attention to his work. He was a monk over in Eastern Europe in some backwater breeding peas. The scientists in Paris and London, the fashionable cities who were doing the great science, they weren't going to pay any attention to some monk over in Eastern Europe. And it wasn't until after his death that people started looking into inheritance and realized that Gregor Mendel had done a lot of really important work on the subject. So what did he do? All right, so he did these experiments with pea plants. And he took strains of pea plants that bred true for flower color. And what that means is if you took these purple flowers and bred purple flower plants with other purple flower plants, you always got purple. Okay? Nothing else ever came up. Same with white. If you bred the white ones with the white ones, you always get white. So that's true breeding. So what Mendel did was he controlled which plants cross-fertilized with which others. And so he took a tiny little brush and he took the pollen from one plant's flowers and put it on another plant's flowers, on the female part of the other plant. And then he raised the offspring, the peas from that generation. So the first generation is called the pea or parental generation. The next generation is called the F1 generation or first filial. And what he found was when he crossed purple and white flowers, all the offspring were purple. And he said, aha, there's something about purple that overshadows the white or is dominant to the white. Then he raised the F1 generations and he allowed them to self-fertilize, or he cross-fertilized them with each other, with themselves, sorry. And he raised their offspring. Their offspring then were the F2 generation. And the F2 generation, he found, had a ratio of 3 purple flowers to 1 white flower. Interesting. He took very, very careful records of all of this. He did these experiments with hundreds and hundreds of pea plants, undoubtedly leading his brothers in the abbey to wish that he were not growing quite so many peas. And so what he discovered was that there is something about purple that is dominant, but it's not always dominant. Something happens in the second generation that makes the white show up. Now, important note. A lot of people confuse dominant with common. And it makes sense, especially when we're showing pictures like this, where we have 3 out of 4 purple, 1 out of 4 white. That means the purple are more common. But that's not always true. There are several dominant alleles that are very rare, and one of those makes individuals have extra fingers or toes. So this is an example of simple dominance of a dominant trait. So this is a cat with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 toes. And this condition of having extra fingers or toes is called polydactyly. And it is caused by an allele change in a single gene. Okay, it actually turns out that there are several genes that control the number of fingers and toes, but an allele change in either one of these, a dominant allele creates extra fingers and toes. As always, it's complicated, okay? So the dominant allele, which we're going to use a capital F for, the dominant allele creates the extra digits. The lowercase or the recessive allele creates the normal number of digits. So everybody who has 10 fingers and toes, who was born with 10 fingers and toes, is homozygous recessive. Okay, that's the most common genotype. This genotype, this phenotype, is rare in most mammalian populations. So I wanted to bring this up just to show an example of simple dominance of a dominant trait or a dominant allele that's uncommon. And I do want to mention that this cat is part of a population on the island of Key West, where Ernest Hemingway used to live, once lived, and his former home is now a museum. And Hemingway had some six-toed cats, and those six-toed cats have continued to breed and live at this museum, and so the museum now has this big population of polydactyly cats, which this one looks like it wants to murder us, but it's probably just half asleep because, you know, cats. All right, so we can do a lot of experiments with controlled crossbreeding, and we know because of the rules of simple dominance what the outcome is going to be, and we can use something called a Punnett square to show what those possibilities are going to be. So we have the true breeding parents were homozygous. They were either homozygous dominant for the purple or homozygous recessive for the white. And here we're going to use the P, capital P is purple, lowercase p is white. So the F1s got one capital P from one parent and one lowercase p from the other parent. So they're all heterozygous. We say heterozygotes, G-O-T-E-S, okay, they are heterozygotes. So they can create sperm and eggs with either a dominant allele or the recessive allele. And then when they crossbreed with another heterozygote, we can predict what the number of each phenotype and genotype of the offspring will be using what we call a Punnett square, named for the geneticist Reginald Punnett, who figured this out. So here we have the eggs, and when we draw a Punnett square like this, we're always going to put the female gametes on one side and the male gametes on the top. So female gametes on the left, male gametes on the top. And each square is going to get one gamete with the possible allele that it could be. So here we have the female can give either a dominant allele or a recessive. The male can give either a dominant or a recessive. Excuse my throat. If the offspring gets these two, then it is homozygous dominant. If it gets these two, it's heterozygous. If it gets these two, it's heterozygous. And if it gets these two, it's homozygous recessive. So we can see very visually clearly 3 purple to 1 white, and the ratio of the genotypes is 1 to 2 to 1. 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygous, 1 homozygous recessive. All right? Now, in our next segment, we're going to talk about some ways that inheritance can be more complicated, because of course it's more complicated. It's always more complicated. There's going to be a worksheet that you can start working on here to do some examples of Punnett squares, some of which are going to have you do simple dominance. Some of them will be with heterozygotes, and some of them will be with homozygous individuals. So that's going to be up to you. All right? So we'll stop there and we'll come back with this next section talking about, more complicated